Wealth is often imagined as something distant, a complicated mountain reserved for the fortunate, the gifted, or the ruthless. Most people believe money is built through loud ambition, endless struggle, or sudden luck. But sometimes the truth is quieter. Getting rich is rarely about doing more. It is about seeing differently, understanding patterns most people ignore, recognizing how power, timing, human nature, and discipline shape outcomes long before success becomes visible. This is not a story about greed. It is a psychological reflection on simplicity and why Machiavelli understood that wealth often belongs to those who stop chasing noise and begin mastering structure. There's a moment that arrives quietly, not as a dramatic breakthrough, not as sudden luck, but as a shift in perception. A person begins to notice something unusual. Those who build wealth are not always extraordinary. They're not always louder, smarter, or more gifted. They simply move differently. For most of life, money is treated as mystery. Wealth feels distant, something reserved for others, protected by complexity. People grow up assuming success must be complicated, accidental, or unreachable. So they stop looking closely. But recognition begins when that assumption softens. The mind realizes that wealth is not magic. It is pattern. The wealthy, in many cases, are not playing a different game. They are playing the same game with clearer rules. They understand something simple. Money is rarely built through emotion. It is built through structure. Machiavelli understood this kind of truth. He wrote about power, not comfort. He saw that outcomes are shaped less by intention and more by positioning, by timing, restraint, and awareness. Wealth works similarly. Most people chase money urgently. They move with impatience. They want quick transformation, but lasting wealth is usually quiet. It is built in decisions no one applauds, in patience no one notices, in discipline that looks ordinary from the outside. The first recognition is unsettling because it removes excuses. If wealth is pattern, then struggle is not always fate. Sometimes it is conditioning. Sometimes it is distraction. Sometimes it is a lack of internal structure. Recognition does not blame. It clarifies. It is the moment the mind stops asking, "Why is this impossible?" and begins asking, "What have I been trained not to see?" Wealth begins not with money, but with perception. And perception begins when illusion ends. Wealth is often presented as something complicated, a distant world filled with rules, secrets, and unreachable doors. Most people grow up believing that money belongs to those who have something special, a rare talent, powerful connections, or extraordinary luck. This belief is comforting because if wealth is complex, then struggle feels explained. If success is mysterious, then failure feels less personal. Psychologically, the mind prefers this illusion. It protects the ego from the discomfort of clarity. It allows people to say, "It's not possible," instead of facing the harder truth. It requires a different structure. From early life, scarcity becomes emotional conditioning. A child hears conversations about money as stress, limitation, fear. Over time, the nervous system learns to associate wealth with danger or distance. So complexity becomes a defense mechanism. The brain turns wealth into an abstract mountain, not because it is truly abstract, but because approaching it would require change. Machiavelli understood this pattern. He knew that most people do not lose power because they are weak. They lose power because they misunderstand the game. They accept stories that keep them passive. The illusion of complexity is one of those stories. It convinces people that wealth is only for others, that success belongs to a different class of mind, that effort without guidance is pointless. But wealth is rarely complicated in action. It is simple in principle. Control impulses, build leverage, think long-term. What makes it difficult is emotional resistance. People chase comfort instead of structure. They react instead of plan. They consume instead of accumulate. The illusion stays alive because it delays responsibility. But the moment a person sees that wealth is not hidden, only disciplined, complexity begins to fall away. And in that falling away, simplicity becomes visible. Wealth is often misunderstood as something purely financial. Numbers, possessions, status. But psychologically, wealth begins much earlier than money. It begins in the mind's relationship with time, control, and impulse. Machiavelli understood that power is rarely gained through force alone. It is gained through awareness, through knowing how people behave, what they desire, and what they fear. Money follows similar laws. The human mind is drawn toward immediate reward. It prefers comfort now over stability later. This is why most people spend rather than build, react rather than plan, consume rather than invest. Psychology calls this short-term bias. Wealth requires the opposite, delayed gratification, the ability to wait, to hold impulse without surrendering to it, to think beyond the emotional present. Power, in Machiavellian terms, belongs to those who control themselves first. Another psychological truth is this: attention is influence. Whatever the mind focuses on grows stronger. The wealthy often focus on systems, leverage, and long-term outcomes. Others focus on appearance, comparison, and urgency. This is not about intelligence in the academic sense. It is about emotional regulation. The person who cannot tolerate uncertainty will choose quick comfort. The person who can endure silence will build slowly. Wealth is often the result of consistency, not intensity. Small choices repeated with discipline become structure, and structure becomes freedom. Machiavelli's insight was never about morality. It was about reality. Money is not attracted to desperation. It responds to positioning. Those who understand wealth psychologically do not chase it loudly. They organize their life around it quietly. They conserve energy. They reduce emotional chaos. They think strategically instead of emotionally. In this sense, getting rich is not a miracle. It is the natural outcome of a mind that has learned restraint, awareness, and control. Even when the mind begins to understand wealth clearly, resistance appears. Not from the outside, but from within. Because changing one's relationship with money is not only practical, it is emotional. For many, wealth carries invisible weight. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of becoming different from the life they have always known. Psychologically, the mind clings to familiarity, even when familiarity is limiting. Scarcity becomes identity. A person may say they want wealth, but internally they may feel safer staying where expectations are lower. Because success creates exposure. It invites responsibility. It removes excuses. Machiavelli understood this hesitation. He knew that people often resist power not because they dislike it, but because it demands change. Wealth is similar. To build it, the mind must let go of impulsive comfort, old habits, emotional spending, the need for quick relief, and that letting go feels like loss. Another form of resistance is guilt. Some people associate wealth with selfishness, arrogance, or corruption, so the mind creates conflict. To want more feels wrong, even if survival requires it. Comparison also enters here. The mind looks outward and sees others progressing faster. This creates impatience, doubt, a quiet sense of inferiority. But wealth is rarely a race. It is a structure built over time. Fear makes people rush, and rushing makes people fragile. This chapter is the emotional battlefield, not between rich and poor, but between impulse and discipline, between comfort and growth, between the old self and the one learning to think differently. Resistance is not weakness. It is the mind protecting its familiar world. But once fear is seen clearly, it loses some of its grip, and the path becomes less about force and more about steady internal control. There comes a moment when the mind stops romanticizing wealth. It no longer imagines money as destiny or luck. It sees it as position. This is the turning point. Machiavelli wrote that power belongs not to the most virtuous, but to the most aware. Those who understand timing, perception, and human nature move ahead without noise. Wealth follows the same principle. Most people believe money is earned only through effort, but effort alone is common. What separates outcomes is clarity. The turning point is realizing that wealth is built through leverage, not exhaustion, through restraint, not desperation, through patience, not constant movement. This is not about manipulation. It is about reality. The world responds to results, not intentions. Machiavelli understood that waiting for fairness is a trap. So is waiting for support, permission, or ideal conditions. At this stage, the mind becomes quieter. It stops seeking validation for ambition. It stops explaining itself. It begins to operate strategically. The person understands that wealth is often invisible while it's being built. No applause arrives in the beginning. No one notices discipline. But this invisibility is an advantage. Silence protects progress. The Machiavellian turning point is internal. A person stops asking, "Will this work?" and begins asking, "What is the structure?" They stop chasing comfort. They stop reacting emotionally to setbacks. They stop leaking energy into distraction. Instead, they position themselves. They think long-term. They realize wealth is not complicated. It is simply rare because most minds cannot tolerate simplicity. Simplicity demands consistency, and consistency demands self-control. This is where getting rich becomes less of a dream and more of an outcome. Not a fantasy, a pattern. Once this turning point occurs, the mind is no longer confused by wealth. It becomes aligned with it, quietly. After clarity comes the hardest part, consistency. Wealth is rarely built through sudden intensity. It is built through quiet discipline. This discipline is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not look impressive from the outside. It looks like repetition, structure, restraint. Machiavelli understood that lasting power is not held by constant force, but by stability, by the ability to remain steady while others fluctuate. Money requires the same steadiness. The mind begins to shift away from emotional living. Impulse becomes visible. Distraction becomes costly. Short-term pleasure loses its control. Instead, the person begins building systems. Small choices repeated daily. Habits that feel ordinary. A life organized around long-term outcomes rather than immediate comfort. This is where wealth becomes simple. Not easy, but simple. Discipline is psychological regulation. It is the ability to tolerate boredom without escaping, to tolerate uncertainty without panicking, to tolerate silence without needing applause. Most people fail here because they believe motivation must feel exciting. But discipline is often quiet. It is calm persistence without emotional reward. In this stage, the nervous system stabilizes. Money is no longer treated as fantasy or fear. It becomes practical. The person spends less energy proving, less energy comparing, less energy reacting. They conserve attention. They build. And slowly, the mind becomes a container strong enough to hold wealth. Not because money changes the person, but because the person changes the relationship with control. Wealth becomes a byproduct of structure. The quiet discipline is what separates those who dream from those who accumulate. Not brilliance, not luck, just steady alignment. This is where simplicity becomes real. And in that quiet consistency, success begins forming long before anyone notices. In the end, wealth is quieter than people imagine. It is not always luxury, not always display, not always noise. Often, it is simply stability, the ability to breathe without urgency, to move without panic, to choose without desperation. Machiavelli understood that real power is rarely visible in the moment it is being formed. It develops beneath the surface through patience, restraint, and perception. Wealth is similar. Getting rich is simple once the mind stops chasing myths. It is built through clarity, through systems, through control of impulse, through long-term thinking, not through constant hustle, not through obsession, not through emotional chaos. The richest outcomes often come from the calmest minds. The person who learns simplicity is not louder than others. They are steadier. They no longer need to prove progress. They no longer seek approval for ambition. They no longer confuse comfort with fulfillment. They understand that money is not only currency, it is consequence, a consequence of structure, of discipline, of awareness. This understanding is not greedy. It is honest, because poverty is not always tragedy, and wealth is not always virtue. Both are shaped by psychology as much as circumstance. The world remains unpredictable. People remain complex. But the mind that sees clearly is no longer lost inside confusion. It moves quietly. It builds patiently. It understands that wealth is not a miracle. It is a pattern repeated over time. And when simplicity is finally understood, the chase ends. What remains is alignment. A life structured with intention. A mind no longer distracted by noise. And in that quiet space, success becomes less of a dream and more of a natural result.